All right, Tech Divas, welcome back to another great episode of Tech Diva Success podcast. And we have the joy of being visited today by the 2019 LA Lakers businesswoman and the 2015 California Charter Teacher of the Year, Genein. She's a thought leader and creator of a concept called intercultural creativity, which she's going to talk about today. She's the founder and chief creative officer of CAFFE Strategies. That's CAFFE. And she trains executives and employees on how to create sustainable equity. We're all about that as tech divas, and inclusion strategies as well, while unleashing their innovative thinking about themselves and their business. And that's where her 7 gems come in. It's her framework. She's going to share some of that with us today. And her first book is actually called From Debt to Destiny, Creating Financial Freedom from the Inside Out. So she has a wide variety of skills and lessons today that she's going to bring to us that will help make us 1% better, 10% better, 50% better, all the percent better for tech divas to thrive. So welcome to the show, Genein.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we all know you have some gems for sure for us, but we've seen a lot of change over the pandemic. Everything's gone faster. And with the digital acceleration is the need to have more innovation, which goes back to the need of having more diversity. So I don't know if that's a good place for you to start, just to kind of get us going.
Especially with just defining the words. You know, the word creativity, first of all, half of the population think they're not creative because they're not artistic. So I keep hearing, oh, I can't sing well, I can't draw well. And it's like, no, creativity is so much more than that. So what does it look like to be creative? And then as I was doing my workshops and trainings and coaching, I realized a lot of people, we can work on the skill. Creativity is a skill of having new ideas and of value. But it won't work if you're in a culture or in an environment that is not conducive to creative thinking. There's pushback against the status quo. It's toxic. You can't speak up. There's no psychological safety going on. So that's the term, and that's the birthing basically of intercultural creativity. And another thing is intercultural. People think culture is only ethnicity or nationality, but when you think of culture is just a group of people with different, with beliefs and values. You can have a soccer mom culture, a tech culture, right? Just different phrasing and speak that only like tech folks know. And so how do you look at the skills of building cultural competence, your ability to see people, see complexity, and adapt in different cultural groups, and then create? And so I realized that the skills to build cultural competence is the same skills to build creative thinking. So why not bring them together?
That is a beautiful merging of those. So tell us more. I mean, that's what we want. You've said a lot of key things there. Psychological safety. Anytime I hear that, I'm like, yes, yes, yes. It is the key to creativity. And like you said, the key to creating these cultures as well. So do you want to double click into that some more to be tech language about it?
Sure. Double clicking. And that's the thing is my book that I'm coming out, The 7 Gems of Intercultural Creativity. I even talk about language and how language can lead creative production and what language does to build concepts in your brain, and how masculine and feminine words and different types of language can produce, basically different types of ideas. So the 7 Gems of Intercultural Creativity is an alignment with basically what Abraham Lincoln said about the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, if I'm known for anything, it'll be for this, and my whole soul is in it. And I feel the same way about intercultural creativity. Not that I'm freeing a whole group of people, but I am freeing people up to be their creative selves with one another, with different lived backgrounds. And so the 7 gems, number 1, creative growth mindset. It's based off of the work of Carol Dweck, but adding creativity in there. And so people who understand that creative thinking and intercultural competence are developmental skills that can be worked on and advanced, that's the first step. If you don't think you can be more creative, then your brain's just going to shut down, right? And number 2 is the empathetic way, having open mind and open heart. And empathy, that word has gained some steam within the last 5-10 years in the business world. Us people who work with children already know the importance of empathy and learning and emotion and how the brain takes in information. But I'm glad the business world is taking heed, because leadership is going to have to understand what part does empathy play in their ability to lead and adapt. And the third one is cultural observation. Cultural observation is so important because as data, as you know, the way we are creative is we have to interact with different data and recombine the data. So if you're not observant with what you're doing, with what you're around, if you have your phone in front of your face for the whole time, then you have no data to interact with. And so how do you be more observant of your environmental surroundings? But then how do you transfer those same skills to be more observant with other people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different experiences? So that's connected. And be more observant about yourself, right? And understand where you're coming from. And the fourth one, cultural curiosity. So I just interviewed someone on my podcast named Dr. Allison Hoistmeyer, who is like a PhD in curiosity out of USC. And she talked about workplace curiosity. And I tell people, if creativity is the driver of innovation, curiosity is a driver of creativity. So what does it look like to have intellectual curiosity about the tech world, to be able to use your imagination to see and invent what no one else sees yet? And there's a lot of work to be done, but you can actually develop this skill. The next gem, the fifth gem, is perspective shifting. I just interviewed someone by the name of Dr. Michael Platt, who looked at how leaders need to work on the skill to perspective shift, and to see things from multiple points of view. And actually, when you go higher in leadership, whether it's in your startup or whether it's in a tech company, you lose the ability to perspective shift just because you don't have to. People are shifting their perspectives to you. You don't really exercise that ability to perspective shift. So what does it look like to hone in on that skill and make sure it stays strong, even as you get more advanced positions? The sixth one out of 7 is authentic adaptation. And the skill and the ability to adapt. I talk about 2 types of adaptation: crisis adaptation and cultural adaptation. So how do you adapt in a crisis, which we all had to do last year, right? But how do you adapt in different cultural situations? Can you flow through different scenarios and through different groups? And the last one I think we all want to be at is being the bridge, being a cultural connector. Malcolm Gladwell talks about those people who are a connector. They're on the borders of different fields, so they can connect people, your artists to your engineers, to your tech people, to your writers. And they're the connectors, but they also have to have the skills to go throughout different cultures. So what does that look like, and how do we prepare ourselves to be interculturally creative?
Well, let's take a look at some of those, because I love all of these. Of course, everyone needs to be going to get your book. So we'll make sure we launch that when it goes live through our channels so that we can support you, because these are all critical things to what you're trying to do of innovation and creativity in the workplace, but even more important to our mission as women in tech, because all of these things lead to places where we can exercise our authentic selves, and we can come with those creative ideas with that psychological safety, no judgment, open ideas, being not afraid to fail. I know I'm an idea person, so I put a lot of ideas out there. That means some were not going to be successful. So you can't get hurt if your creative idea isn't taken, because you're in a safe place of saying this may work, this may not work. Let's talk about empathy for a minute. Your second gem. What do you think people can do, tech divas, to be more empathetic? We have that nature in us, but what are some ways that we can apply empathy in the workplace?
Well, we are born with it, and different people have different levels of it. You heard of people who are empaths, right? And they just can feel everyone. And I used to hate the fact that I would cry at commercials growing up, like, why am I so sensitive? Now it's actually a benefit as opposed to a liability. So the first thing is to be aware. The other thing is you get to be more empathetic once you take the risk to reach out and connect. And I have an arts background. Even though I say creativity isn't only artistry, I say artistry can strengthen your ability to be more creative in non-arts fields, in technology, in business, in math, in entrepreneurship. Some of your top Nobel Prize winners in science have an arts background, because the music, it communicates an emotion, right? The writing, the poems, they communicate an emotion without using words for, and poems do, and just different types of communication. So when we strip the arts away from our kids, we strip away avenues for them to work on their empathy. Another thing that adults can do, number one, is to go get an arts, experience, but we could just, like I said before, connect. You could connect in multiple ways. You could connect through novels. I just spoke to a person named Hang Black, and she just wrote a book about her immigrant experience, about leaving Vietnam, 2 days before Saigon fell, and getting on a boat and being thrown onto a larger boat to get over here, and the experience that her family had in the late 70s and 80s of growing up with that experience. So I've never had that experience. So for me to be more empathetic to her, to read her book, to take, it's almost like I'm sitting down with her, side by side, hearing her story. And so really opening your library and understanding that there's different ways for people to communicate their lived experience to you, in addition to face-to-face speech.
Yeah, Hang is amazing. We did interview her. She really has blazed a trail for many of us. And I love how she does come with her authentic self, for example. Now, people don't always associate technology, especially certain roles, programming and building a network with creativity. What are some ways, do you have like an exercise or a favorite way that we could start to connect the dots between creativity and a profession that is very bits and bytes, zeros and ones?
Because the outlook or the way it's seen doesn't look very creative, means we need it even more, correct? And I interviewed a neuroscience doctor on my podcast. It's not yet published, but Dr. Moran Seth, and he said, fictional science, right? Science fiction is science just, years before. When you look at the shows of Star Trek, in the 70s, Jean-Luc Picard had an iPad in the 70s. There's actual pictures of them. So science fiction is just Gene Roddenberry and these other producers, these other writers using here's the kicker for your crew, imagination. When we hear that word, we think about children. Oh, they're using their imagination, but it is even more critical for adults. And it's even more critical for people in the tech field and in the science field, because you have to imagine uses for the technology that is growing every day. You have to imagine uses that are ethical for the AI and for the machine learning and for the robotics and the VR and AR. And you have to imagine things that aren't even invented yet. If you can't produce it in your mind, it's very difficult to produce it in your hand. And so every great idea starts in the mind. And so to do imagination training, I think people are surprised to hear that you could be trained in imaginative thinking, right? And it is one of the 13 thinking tools by Dr. Ruth Burstein, which is a great book. But I have my 16 thinking tools, my 16 diamond tools of highly creative thinkers. And imagination is one of those tools, because if it doesn't start in your imagination, it won't get to us in the field.
I agree. So the tech divas out there, you can challenge your team to be more imaginative. You can get a hold of Genein. She can help you. Of course, that's the easy one. We usually save it till the end, but I'm sure you can engage with teams around all of these things, but that's probably one I know that you can bring things to the table. And as leaders, giving that space for imaginative play. Yeah. And what I took away from what you said is you were like, hey, if we can dream it and we can imagine an iPad or, taking our consciousness and putting it into a robot or whatever we can imagine, we can do that in the future. And that's what we're seeing, even in that cheesy example I just said about putting your consciousness into a robot. Those are real technologies people are developing today. What I take away from that is that that's how it is for the potential we have, our human potential, our career potential, our life experience. If you can dream that you can be something, you can do it. So I just wanted to take away that inspirational analogy of, yes, if we could dream it and do it in the technology space, it's true, but also don't let that be a limiting belief to imagining your potential and dreaming big on your career, on your life goals, on your legacy, and what you can do with the time you have here on the planet. So a little bit
I,
uh,
I will jump in really
yes.
quick because you did ask for something like things that they can do now. Number one is people say that they don't have enough time to imagine. So do you give your people a time to think? They call it, heads down versus heads up. The technical term or the neuroscience term is your focus network, when you're doing emails and bills and you're focused on a task versus your innovative network. And that's when your brain is basically daydreaming. Do you give enough time for your people to daydream? My son is 3 and I stopped, like saying, Sean, come back to me, because I stopped his innovative network from really getting traction because he's in his own world. That means he's sitting with his own thoughts. He's daydreaming. He's picturing things that, I don't even know what he's picturing, but he is working within himself. And that's why people are disconnected. Most of it, unless there's trauma or something going on. But for my son, there's not. But from a leadership perspective, do you actually work into the schedule daydreaming time? Because then we construe it as, oh, they're not working or they're being lazy. If you know that they are daydreaming, they're thinking of your next product or your next usage for this technology.
Yes, and that's part of unlocking potential when you're building solutions for your customers. If we could dream about what they could do with it, then you can back into why they need to purchase AB or invest in these solutions. All right, another one that caught my eye was Gem 5 on perspective shifting. I am constantly loving this gem because it's so important. We have to have it. I always say, okay, you're giving me a draft. This happened today. You're giving me a draft of a letter you're sending an executive. So read it like an executive. Get into their head. And I think that's key in so many areas. It's key for women in tech to challenge men, for example, to think and reversing it, how would you feel if that was a comment made against you? How would you feel? But I think it's even bigger to the social justice problems we have, which is not the scope of the show, but that's how powerful perspective shifting is. And I love that gem. But to put it in the scope of women in tech, what are some ways that everyone can start? And you're right, perspective is all things, not just your race or your gender. It's where you've come from. It's your life experiences. It's what you've been through. It's if you've served or not served. And there's so many things to it. How do you challenge people to step into that other perspective, to put on that view of someone else? What are some tips there?
So this is a critical one. I'm so glad it became highlighted to you. I just want you to understand that this gem sits on the other gems, right? So it's difficult to be a great perspective shifter if you're not curious about the other person's perspective, if you're not observant about your own experience and other experiences, and if you're not empathetic and have an open mind. So be clear about that. Another thing about perspective shifting is just like when you watch a child, and my research comes from many different ways, but it does come from watching a 3-year-old child just interact with his environment. But when he gets a new toy, it's not just, oh, let's play with the toy, but he's looking at it from all different angles. So how can you metaphorically do that in your situation as well? And so I like your example about a letter that you're drafting to leadership, an executive leader. Like, what does that look like? And don't just look at how he or she or the person would construe it, but what are some of the forces that they're dealing with concurrent, to leading you as well? What are some of the concerns that they may have? Because they have a bird's eye view of the organization. You just have your one particular task. So keeping that in mind. And another thing is you're able to better perspective shift when you're empathetic, but also when you have the knowledge. So doing a little background work, you have to do the work of understanding where their lived experience is coming from. And I have this concept called the diversity diamond, where it's a beautiful diamond with not all of them, but a lot of the demographics and psychographics, don't forget that, but the demographics of the 4 that we normally think about, your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender. There's like 4 that always come to mind, but there's so many more that are coloring that are your cultural lenses that are coloring the way you see the world. And I just did a workshop this morning and I sent that diamond out to like, oh, I never thought about my fill in the blank, my education level, my where I grew up, or my affiliation to this, or my position in the organization. There's so many other things that are coloring the way you see the world. So to perspective shift for yourself, to know where you are, and then that'll better enable you to perspective shift to other people. Because if you don't have no clue where you're shifting from, it's difficult to perspective shift. So understanding who you are, what your experience is, and then shifting to the other person.
Yes. And that was a great call out, how the gems layer on each other. So you have to be empathetic in order to be perspective shifting. And that is so important. And I love the sides of the diamond. I mean, even a mindset, if someone comes from everything from a positive mindset, that's a different perspective than someone who's always looking at devil's advocate. And that's not something that's, diversity. And I love how you expand the definition to be more than that core four, those core things that we think about for diversity and what it looks like, because perspective is all, it's so important. So obviously they're all great, and people are going to be looking at, how they can really apply these. I'm sure wheels are already turning in their imagination of how they could take this and make their work lives better, their career better, their teams better. But we only have so much time with you. And if they want to dig in, they're going to get to you. But before we leave, what is like one powerful takeaway you have for Tech Divas? If they were to take one action, if they were to really take one thing away from this podcast, what would be the most important one thing you would want them to know?
The uniqueness of you. We went through systems, and I spent my first part of my career in the education system. I was an educator. So I know for the majority of your audience what they went through. And a lot of it is conforming, do this, get a high score on the SAT, ACT, get into a decent university, and then fill this role. And now people are starting to understand, wait, we need to accentuate and to celebrate the uniqueness of your lived experience. Just like how every snowflake has a different design, because the route from the sky to the ground is different for every single snowflake. Well, the same for you. What is your unique perspective that you're bringing to your startup, your organization? And are you in a place that allows you to share your unique perspective? Because there's where the invention, the technology, the it factor will be for us to move this nation and this world forward.
And that could be a consideration as to where people build their careers. Are you at a company that allows you to be your unique self? And thinking about that in addition to pay and salary, because those are the things that are going to unlock your potential and what you can provide to the company. So totally amazing. You could tell your teaching skills and this important these important gems you have are just so awesome. And I am just honored to have you on the show. I know people want to connect with you after this because they want to grab your book when it's out. They might want to bring you on to do some team building. There's lots that you offer. So where is the best place they can connect, and what else should they know?
Awesome. So we do have trainings, workshops, practicums in perspective shifting and DEI work, like bias, and how all these elements can add to your creative thinking when they're managed and they're properly, addressed. And so they can find me at CAFFE Strategies. CAFFE Strategies stands for Creative Advancement for Financial Empowerment, CAFFE Strategies. And they can find me there. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So if they're looking for creative ideas or different ways of looking at different concepts, they can follow me on my page, Genein Letford. And I also have CAFFE Strategies on all of the platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as well.
Great. And tell us real quickly about your podcast. So if people want to listen to that.
Sure. I am just using my podcast to get some great content out. So that is called Create and Grow Rich. We've had Dr. Michael Platt, a top neuroscientist, a top curiosity doctor, Dr. Allison, and fingers crossed, we're looking to have Dr. Timothy Clark, the author of The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety.
Great. We're here to raise each other up. There's too often that we see people competing for mind share. And you know what? The more you know, the more you grow. So we're always here to provide more resources for tech divas and allies to get better, because these gems that you've laid out today can help get 1% better and so much more, because it is the foundational things you need to create powerful, enjoyable life and career moments. So I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing, obviously for being on the show, but the show is only one microphone to a voice that you have so carefully curated, designed, and intentionally created these gems. So I really am celebrating your work, celebrating you, and just want to thank you for everything you're doing. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the show as well.
Well, I had a great time sharing this, and thank you for opening your platform for such an important message.
Yes. All right. Thanks again.